last time we left off about here, we were looking at the preparations for Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion that everyone knew was coming all over the world. On one side of the English Channel in England, American and British forces amassing huge amounts of supplies, weapons, troops, etc. And on the other side, in France, occupied France, General Erwin Rommel was left with the unenviable task of trying to prepare defenses all across the coastline of France, since he didn't know where the attack would come. But he prepared the Atlantic Wall, as it came to be known, as best he could. And as it says here, he was of the belief that if the invasion wasn't repelled and stopped in its tracks in the first 24 hours, that it wouldn't succeed at all. I mean, the Germans would lose, at least over the long haul. It was left to General Eisenhower, with the complete confidence of President Roosevelt and Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, to make crucial and extremely difficult decisions. There was an enormous weight on his shoulders, and General Eisenhower was up to the task. There were two issues right as D-Day was approaching, the date that they had set for the invasion. One was because of the weather. There was a question of whether they should proceed or postpone the invasion. They postponed it by one day and then decided, or had to decide the next day whether they would postpone it again. But it got a little more tricky than even that, because if they had postponed a second day, they would have had to wait a number of weeks, because the tides were crucial to the success of this operation, and they were going to have to wait for a low tide again, which wouldn't come for a number of weeks. And surprise was of the essence in all of this. So it would have been difficult to wait extra weeks, since the surprise was maybe already, they were already fortunate to have not been discovered at this point. So in the end, gathering his advisors around him, both British and military, Eisenhower asked all of their advice, and half of them approximately said go, and half of them said no, we should postpone. Eisenhower got up from his chair, walked around the room thinking for a minute or so, and finally said, let's go. And the wheels were then set in motion. This massive machine of tanks, planes, ships, troops, food, medicine, supplies, were all in motion, headed towards the beaches of France. The other question that he had to deal with, an excruciating one, was that there were planned airborne landings behind German lines in France the night before D-Day. Two American airborne divisions, the 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne, and one British airborne division. But Eisenhower's intelligence sources said that the paratroopers landing behind the lines were likely to have 70% casualties. I don't know how much you've studied military history, but 70% casualties is a disaster. It's almost unheard of. So with that in mind, Eisenhower also had to make a decision whether or not to go through with the airborne landings, given that it looked like a suicide mission. In the end, he decided that it was necessary to do anyway, even if they did take 70% casualties, though fortunately, after the fact, it was clear that the estimates were wrong. They did take high casualties, but not even close to 70%. But Eisenhower had to make the decision at the time, believing that his intelligence was roughly accurate, and about 70% of the paratroop soldiers were going to be killed or wounded. The reason he thought it was still essential that they go is because dropping them behind lines had kind of a twofold purpose. One, they were to establish control of bridgeheads and certain strategic crossroads before the troops landing in larger numbers the next day. came came from the ships to the beaches, and then would have an easier time if some of those objectives were already secured by the paratroopers. But maybe more importantly was that by landing 12,000 or so troops behind German lines, it would force them to fight in two directions on D-Day, which meant siphoning some of the German forces, away from the beach or beaches. And Eisenhower's reasoning was simply that if the landings on the beaches fail, the whole invasion fails for sure. Because if we don't get onto the beaches or stay on the beaches, we can't get trucks and tanks and all our supplies offloaded. So unfortunately, as often happens in war, he had to make a lesser of two evils decision. So he thought anyway, and decided the paratroopers, if they take 70% casualties, sadly, it's going to have to. It's just going to be the way it is. And he didn't do it easily. Eisenhower was not a cruel man, but it probably was the right decision, as hard as that is to have to say and contemplate. You see in the bottom middle a remarkable letter that Eisenhower wrote to his whole army that would also get out to, of course, the whole country and world. He basically, if you read this, takes the full blame. He writes this letter as if the invasion has failed. He put it in an envelope after he signed it, sealed it, and handed it to one of his adjutants and said, "Mail this if the invasion fails." Meaning, he was taking the blame completely, saying the whole thing is on me. It's my fault. Anything that went wrong. And I just find it remarkable because you don't see many leaders today taking that much responsibility. It was out of his hands after he sealed it. I mean, literally. So the guy was under orders to deliver it to the mail and sort of make it widespread. And I'm sure it would have. But since the invasion did succeed, though not easily, the guy never did have to mail it. So on June 6, 1944, once again, we have one of the largest of this or that, the greatest amphibious assault in human history, the longest day. Remember the phrase from Irvin Rollin himself, a movie of that title about D-Day, made in the 70s, which is actually a pretty good one considering how dated it is. So there were 5 beachheads codenamed by the Allies ahead of time: Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, where American troops exclusively landed, and Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, where British and mostly Canadian troops landed. The Canadians landed at Juno, I believe. And as luck or fate would have it, all of the beaches except for one were fairly easy to clear and for the Allies to establish a beachhead. The unlucky soldiers were in the American sector, those that landed on Omaha Beach, who were stranded in the sand for hours. Those that actually made it, out of the surf as their landing craft dropped them up the beach, and eventually, piling behind a seawall, which gave them enough cover for the time being to be safe. But they took huge casualties as they came out of their craft and up the beach. And a second wave had the same thing happen to them. So another second wave is kind of on top of the first wave. It's crowded behind that wall. It wasn't until the third wave when some of the officers in that wave recognized that the men here are stunned. They're in shock, and they're not even officers, and they're not responding well. It's going to be a problem. One such officer said, now famously, "The only people on this beach are the dead and those that are going to die. So let's get the hell out of here now." But what he and others recognized is the troops that are stunned, understandably stunned, were in more danger laying behind that wall with current protection than they would be if they got over the wall and ran out into the open and exposed themselves to direct enemy fire. The reason being that by being there so long, it was only a matter of time before German artillery and mortar units got their coordinates and started dropping, ordnance straight on their head. This is just math. So sometimes it's called zeroing. Zero on the other side's position, and then you can bring really effective fire. So the officers in the third wave recognize this is a dangerous situation with our troops stunned, laying in the sand, and being immobile. Troops need to move so they don't get zeroed in on. As the size of the force was, again, largest amphibious assault ever. You can see here 7,000 ships in one spot. By the way, these are the beaches of a place called Normandy in northwestern France. I may not have mentioned that before. So it had been a duchy of long standing here. The code names were just code names for the invasion itself. But Normandy is a section of northwestern France. 155,000 soldiers landed that day. 3,700 fighter pilots to support the troops going ashore. 1,400 transport planes, much of which was about the paratroopers going the night before. In the end, approximately 10,000 Allied casualties, about 2,500 killed and missing, about 7,500 wounded. Of the casualties, 6,500 approximately were American, and only about 4,000 British and Canadian casualties combined. So a pretty violent day, particularly for Americans on Omaha Beach. But by the end of the day, even on Omaha Beach, American forces had sort of taken some German pillboxes and defensive positions like the one you see in the lower left, and eventually found a way inland. And the race was on now to see if they could get across Paris, which was no easy task indeed. We're going to skip that. So the Battle of Normandy was kind of a separate battle on its own. Getting ashore was not enough. Now they had to push all the way across France. And it wasn't easy terrain to get through with an enemy, waiting for them, defending against them. Lots of little towns and villages. You can see some of them here. The French countryside was famous for hedgerows, which you see in the pictures in the upper middle and upper right, sometimes separating one person's land from another, were these thick shrubs and bushes sort of going all the way down kind of a road. So on the other side of that road would often be another hedgerow. And these things were so thick, it was actually, you couldn't really see through them. You could get through them. A tank could, of course, roll over them. But a soldier, like you see some here, could get through them, but they'd have to kind of push their way through, and they didn't necessarily know what was on the other side. So this layout of the terrain made this a battle for Normandy about a month-long fight. Extremely violent and difficult. The Allies committed about 39 divisions, American, British, Canadian, to this battle, and it divides it up there. I was looking at the bottom. What are those other statistics? But you see 22 American divisions, 12 British, 3 Canadian, a Polish, and a French one. Over 1 million troops had poured ashore, at least after D-Day itself, and were now taking part in this gigantic battle. So D-Day was just the very beginning of this. The battle for Normandy itself was intense. Around a month into the operation, a number of German units were basically trapped in what's known as the Falaise Pocket. Not as many of them were trapped as it had been hoped, or maybe should have been, but in the end it was a clear victory that opened the way for Normandy to be an Allied victory, and then the breakout through France, which was much quicker and faster movement. The hedgerows in Normandy had been slow gains, slow progress, but this, after the Falaise Pocket episode, things sped up somewhat. Martin Gilbert, quoting Dwight D. Eisenhower, who said roads, highways, and fields were so chalked up with destroyed equipment and with dead men and animals that passage through them was extremely difficult. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. Terrible to behold, but unfortunately true. About 10,000 Germans killed, 50,000 captured in the Falaise Pocket episode of the Western War. By the end of the summer, the Allies had pushed all the way to Paris and into it. And on August 25th, in a bittersweet moment, the American troops, Allied troops, marched through the city, the Champs-Élysées, here with the Arc de Triomphe behind it. But French soldiers and the French leader Charles de Gaulle were actually allowed to go first. You see de Gaulle in the upper right. So this was bittersweet because certainly the French were elated to be liberated from the Nazis who had occupied them for about 4 years. But there had been a lot of suffering along the way. You can see the numbers in the text in the bottom right. The leadership qualities and abilities of Dwight D. Eisenhower have been questioned a lot by historians, but I think more recently there's been a consensus for the most part that agrees that he had flaws, but that he basically was an excellent leader. He had to manage huge egos in this war, and he did so quite deftly. Eisenhower was a low-key leader, both later as president and as a general in this war, so much so that some thought him a weak leader. But Eisenhower was quite, I think, crafty as a leader. He one time said, "Any damned fool can yell and scream at people to get things done. I do things more indirectly." So he was sort of the perfect guy to kind of handle these fragile and gigantic egos. On the left, you see Bernard Montgomery, the British general already mentioned, an incredibly arrogant individual that disagreed with Eisenhower all the time, sometimes actually countermanded his orders. And on the right, the legendary George C. Patton, right, the right-hand picture. He's the left person furthest to the left in the picture, with Eisenhower on the right, Omar Bradley in the middle. But Patton matched Montgomery in arrogance and flash and dash in every way, and the two of them competed a lot for glory. Patton's army and Montgomery's army on the same side, but they both wanted the glory, and they knew the other guy might get it before them. So sometimes in Italy, here in France, they had sort of raced each other to get to certain cities and pushed their troops harder and harder in order to defeat the other guy and get the credit for such victories. So managing egos effectively was a part of what made this operation successful, with Eisenhower kind of holding it all together. Montgomery's influence can be seen here in the fall of 1944, as they're still kind of in France, but starting to push into the Ardennes forest and into Belgium and Luxembourg, and eventually into Germany, if all went right. But Montgomery had a plan. It's not all his fault. Eisenhower did accept the plan in the end, and so they both and others share the blame for this. But Operation Market Garden, as it came to be known, the largest airborne assault in history, so mostly paratroopers taking place in this, sometimes referred to as a bridge too far, or the question mark, a bridge too far, because the idea was to get to a number of bridges in Holland, cross them, and then get into Germany in a more direct route. If you see the map here in the middle, Germany on the right of the map, in the yellow places, little splotches where the bridges were, they're not far from Germany. And so the idea was, if we sort of move north of our normal position in France into Belgium, through Belgium into Holland, and capture those bridges intact and move across them, we're not too far from the heart of Germany. Actually, the heart of industry in Germany is right there as well. So it was certainly tempting to do, but in order to make this work, not only the 3 airborne divisions, 2 American, 1 British, had to do things just right, but an American force of tanks and troops and trucks and supplies would be coming down a road to get across the bridges that had been saved from being demolished and guarded. And you see in the bottom left of the map, kind of a black arrow. That's the road and the route that the sort of reinforcements, or really sort of the main bulk of forces that would go into Germany if this worked, would go. But it didn't work. It ended up being a disaster. Once again, showing us that this war was no easy task. Defeating Nazi Germany was extremely fraught with peril. Andrew Roberts says, what became known jointly as Market Garden used up scarce Allied resources, manpower, and oil at precisely the moment that Patton was nearing the Rhine River without insuperable opposition. Once the Allied armies stalled for lack of supplies, however, they would be unable to cross the borders of the Reich for another 6 months. So had this operation not been undertaken, had Montgomery not proposed it, had Eisenhower not accepted it, it's possible the war in Europe would have ended 6 months sooner. They certainly would have gotten across the Rhine sooner, but things stalled out for a while after this. So this was a setback, and certainly a bad decision by General Eisenhower, and one that he does bear criticism and responsibility for. By the winter of 1944 and 45, it looked like it was almost over. The Americans and Brits had pushed into the Ardennes forests again in the middle of winter. The snow on the ground everywhere, bitter cold, and it looked like it was over. The Americans and their British allies appear to have kind of let their guard down, thinking that was over. But they should have known by this time Hitler was a gambler. Hitler didn't give up. So Hitler launched a massive surprise attack in December that held on through January of that year. A massive German surprise offensive that pushed Allied forces back considerably, I think about 35 miles, at least in the places that they attacked. 600,000 Americans were engaged in this battle, making it the largest battle in American history. There were, of course, British troops as well. Oh, it drove the back 55 miles. I didn't even see my own graphic. Famously, elements of the 101st Airborne Division were surrounded at a place called Bastogne and held out long enough to eventually be relieved. It was Patton's army coming from the south that really broke through and sort of got those troops out that had been surrounded. Eisenhower had seen the Battle of the Bulge, even after the 55-mile advance by the Germans, as an advantage, at least a possible one, because if one part of a military's line is exposed by 55 miles out in front of everybody else, that means you can sort of hit them at the sides and possibly surround troops, and you get huge amounts of surrenders. This is sort of what happened at the Battle of Verdun, or at least was attempted in the Battle of Verdun. There was a salient, a pocket. Here they called it a bulge, but it's really the same thing. Unfortunately, Montgomery, as was so often the case, didn't totally follow orders. Patton did just enough to break through, but even he didn't sort of move with the alacrity that everybody, on the general staff, especially Eisenhower, wanted. But Hitler's forces did basically die out after pushing that 55 miles. Germany was so weakened by this time, less manpower, less fuel, less tanks, that everything would have had to break just exactly right for this to be a success. Even though it was an astonishing success considering the disadvantages the Germans were at by this time, for it to actually have turned the tide of the war on the Western Front, everything would have had to break perfectly right, and it didn't. The odds have been against it, but Hitler, I told you, was a gambler. The next unenviable step was crossing the Rhine River. And in the map in the bottom middle, you can kind of see the route taken by all Allied forces in different armies moving in different directions. We're mainly focused on the ones that sort of got ashore and then are moving kind of diagonally from low to high towards the upper right, both British and American. But you can see there where it says Cologne, a big city in western Germany. Right to the left of Cologne is a long river going up and down, north to south. That's the Rhine. And it's a pretty wide river, so this was no easy pickings, especially with German forces on the other side, waiting for them. Landing craft here taking soldiers across. So this was a pretty heavy firefight and slog as well. Most of the bridges across the Rhine had been blown by Germany, so they were building pontoon bridges. You see one here in the lower right. But amazingly, eventually they found the only remaining intact bridge at a place called Remagen, 15 miles south of Cologne, and then started pouring troops and supplies and weapons across that bridge. So the Rhine fell into the hands of the Americans and British, the Allies, and then the race to Berlin was on. And it was a race because the Soviets, by this time, were rapidly moving in the other direction. They'd already pushed, by 1945, German forces, the Wehrmacht, out of their own country into Poland, and they were threatening to push into Germany itself. So the Nazi Third Reich was collapsing on a daily basis from the west and from the east. The Yalta Conference, which took place at the beginning of 1945, January, I believe, the second meeting of the Big Three, this time in Stalin's backyard. Crimea was part of the Soviet Union. Prime Minister Churchill on the left in this picture, Franklin Roosevelt, U.S. President, in the middle. Roosevelt was already quite ill, which would actually lead to his death within a number of months, but he was able to still manage the conference effectively, and some things got done of an important nature. Gerhard Weinberg says, 3 allies trying hard for an accommodation of divergent ideologies and interests, with the great problem being that some of the agreements reached were not afterwards carried out, so that the high watermark of cooperation was followed by new crises rather than more steps toward continued working together. So it looked promising here. The big three leaders seemed to be in agreement on a lot of things, but that broke down quickly once they were away. Yalta was, at this point in the war, more about the political future of Europe and the world than it was military operations, though there were some military decisions made here as well. Dwight Eisenhower could have tried to beat the Russians, the Red Army, to Berlin. Of course, getting to Berlin and capturing Hitler was a prize, and both sides wanted to do it. But the Russians were closer anyway, and Eisenhower, because of that, decided let them take it. But part of the reason is clear, and that is that, as you see at the top, the battle for Berlin was gigantic, and just one of many deadly, bloody battles. So Eisenhower more or less is saying, let the Soviets take the casualties and take down Berlin. They're good at that anyway. Stalin wasn't exactly a leader that was that concerned for loss of life. So Eisenhower is saying they've been doing that all the whole war anyway, making these gigantic sacrifices. Let them do it one more time. So Hitler's final days in the bunker with Berlin collapsing. It's literally true, as you see from the picture in the middle, that Berlin was being defended in part by young boys and old men because there were so few troops, trained of military age left at this point. Hitler was living in an underground bunker for a number of weeks in a bizarre situation with many of his own servants and generals and devoted followers willingly staying there with him, some of them who willingly died with him. Hitler committed suicide twice, sort of, by biting into a cyanide tablet and then apparently blowing his head off. So it was the Russians that got to that bunker first. The Führer bunker, as it was known, and did capture Hitler's remains. so they got that honor, but the Americans basically let them do it.